the environmental group here at All Souls Church, and Green Souls is thrilled to be putting on this panel in collaboration with Interfaith Power and Light. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of events. Our panel is going to last for about 1 hour. Then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. And then we warmly invite all of you to Pierce Hall, where we have organizations from around DC tabling. They're all organizations who are active in climate work, and they would be happy to tell you about the work that they are doing, and also give you opportunities to plug in to climate activism in DC. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Kristen Barker. Kristen Barker is co-founder and director of One Earth Sangha, whose mission is to cultivate a mindful, courageous, and compassionate response to ecological crises. She is a Dharma teacher and board member with the Insight Meditation Community of Washington, D.C., a Green Faith Fellow and graduate of the Community Dharma Leader Program through Spirit Rock. Kristen is also a co-founder of White Awake, whose mission is to develop awareness of race dynamics among white people. She holds a master's in environmental management from Duke University and has worked with several environmental organizations in the D.C. area. Kristen is often found in the pews at All Souls on a Sunday morning, equally inspired by music and spiritual leadership. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Kristen.
For a Buddhist to hear all those things said about the self, it's sort of disorienting. Try to just let go of all that. Okay, well, I'm so delighted to be here with you today. I'm so appreciating all of your courageous presence coming into this conversation. And I'm joined by an esteemed board here to my left, and I'm delighted to introduce each one of them to you. So, speaking to us from a Muslim perspective, Amreen Shafi is an environmental attorney based here in Washington, D.C. Her firm, Shafi Law and Policy, focuses on international environmental law and policy, including climate change, energy policy, and sustainable development. She worked on negotiating the Paris Agreement and the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol as legal expert advising governments on the treaty negotiations. She now helps countries fulfill those obligations. Okay? Yeah. That's our part. Her firm engages with governments, businesses, NGOs, and civil society. Her interfaith work includes a range of trainings, trust building, and service projects around the DC area. She co-founded and co-led the DC chapter of the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, a Muslim Jewish interfaith women's group. So welcome, Amreen. Wonderful to have you with us. Next to her left, y'all know, many of you, Rebecca Parker. So speaking from a Unitarian Universalist Christian perspective, Dr. Parker is All Souls theologian in residence. Dr. Parker has been long engaged with environmental justice and sustainability and the intersections of that with LGBTQ issues, race, and women's rights. Most recently, Dr. Parker helped moderate the global gathering called Towards an Ecological Civilization in Claremont, California, which brought environmental leaders and religious leaders together from around the world. Dr. Parker's books, which I'm going to be talking to her later about, Saving Paradise, catch this title, right? Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire. And Blessing the World with What Can Save Us Now. So welcome, Dr. Parker. Then to Dr. Parker's left, speaking to us from the Christian perspective, is Robin Lewis of the Social Justice and Outreach. She is the Social Justice and Outreach Director for the Beloved Community Church. She also serves as the Environmental Justice Outreach Specialist for Interfaith Power and Light. Robin believes that she has been called as a Christian to be a voice for environmental justice in her community and finds her greatest satisfaction as helping others, especially people of color, marginalized communities, communities become aware of environmental issues that are impacting the quality of life. Robin holds an MA in Sustainable Urban Planning, focusing on climate change from George Washington University, so right here local. Thank you so much for joining us, Robin. And then last, and far to the left, and holding up the other. Speaking from a Jewish perspective, Rabbi Fred Scherlinder. Am I saying that correctly? Good enough? I think you're being generous. Okay. Scherlinder Dobbs serves as Rabbi of Adat Shalom Reconstructionist Congregation, an EPA energy congregation in Bethesda, Maryland. He is also past chair of the Interfaith Power and Light Steering Committee, among other religious environmental volunteers, including serving on the steering committee of Religious Witness for the Earth. I know that group, they're awesome. And the National Coalition for the Environment and Jewish Life. I also heard of them, cool. In addition to extensive eco-Jewish research and writing, he received a 2009 Doctor of Ministry from Wesleyan Theologian Seminary with a thesis on religion and ecology, so that's deep. That's what we have to work with, right? So we should be able to figure this out, right? I think so. Okay. So I'm going to do a little bit of framing. How am I doing on time here? Okay. Okay. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to this relatively unpopular conversation. The pews are not full, right? This is hard territory, and I so appreciate your good minds, your great hearts, and your courage for joining us in this conversation. Last fall clarified that we are woefully behind in making the broad-scale transformation that is needed according to the IPCC 2018 report. At that point, this report was released in October. They clarified that we have merely 12 years to carry out this broad transformation at all levels. Make that 11. This climate crisis has been known to us for more than 30 years. Faith communities have only recently been showing up in significant ways, and frankly, we have a long way to go. However, what you've heard here on the panel is that there is experience here that goes deep. Some people have been in this conversation for a long time. We are witness to and passive collaborators as religious communities to this massive crisis that includes incomparable species loss and the horror of the animal meat industry. Faith communities have been in this conversation within their faith communities, like a Green Souls, but also in these structured institutional ways for some time. Green Faith was founded in 1992. Interfaith Power and Light was founded in 1998. The Global Catholic Climate Movement in 2006. And as I said, many houses of worship, places of practice, have their green groups, their Green Souls. But it is true that we are still in a moment in which these represent the rare green sheep in the flock. I got that from Joelle Novy, the director of Interfaith Power and Light here in DC. Green sheep. Perhaps our traditions are complicit in the moneyed fossil fuel capture of institutional safeguards. That may be true. And perhaps our traditions are peopled with, people. Extracting ourselves from the policies and practices that objectify and ruin the earth may increasingly be a calling, but it now needs to become a practical reality, a lived out truth at all levels. My organization considers, and I now have taken a full-time position with Green Faith and continue to direct One Earth Sangha. We consider that this transformation is an inside-out job, that it happens at all levels, from the individual heart, to family households, to communities, to station, to to nation states. No matter the position of the Trump administration, we consider that we're still in the Paris Agreement at all levels. Organizations can be in the Paris Agreement. You and I can be in the Paris Agreement. We can work with faith communities to promote individuals in decarbonizing as much to contribute to aggregate reductions as to signal that business as usual is not an option if we want to have a sustainable world. This is a cultural transformation that we can signal with our own behavior change, and that may be as much or more important than the particular reductions in CO2. And there's something else we all have to offer. In my tradition, and the Buddhist teachings offer a lens on the role that the mind plays in constructing our experience. This invites an investigation of ways of looking. We are invited to see that how we look forms so much of our experience. And that there are ways of looking that lead onward. There are ways of looking that lead to more suffering and to lessening of suffering. This itself then leads to an understanding that we can be dexterous with view itself. We can pick up the lens that leads to alienation, or we can pick up the lens that leads to compassion. We can look at this world, at ourselves, at other, at cosmos, in a way that leads onward. Faith traditions then are studies in ways of looking at experience, at self, at others. Instead of asking which view is true, we might ask, where does each way of looking lead? To more or less health, justice, well-being? Is there a way to look that leads where we want to go? Well, let's take the inverse of this. We might say that the most powerful and unquestioned belief system in the West is that of scientific materialism. While science is exquisite in its ever-unfolding insights into everything from the Big Bang to the quantum realm, I'm a scienceophile. I love this stuff. Okay? The Buddhist understanding is that it considers its discoveries both true and not true. Ultimately true and not true. Helpful, but not in all contexts. It doesn't answer all questions. For instance, can we notice how this view gives no place or meaning to the individual life except perhaps in the accumulation of money, power, achievement, celebrity, and all of that only provisionally so. When we look at the rise in suicides, drug overdoses, and even in the most benign but still painful forms, loneliness at broad scale, anxiety and depression, these reflect the cost, perhaps, to our lives of this ultimately alienating arch narrative. Similarly, this view gives entire peoples, species, and places no inherent value. We're a bunch of billiard balls. We're a bunch of atoms banging around against each other. If I have a spiritual experience, well, that's just some chemistry firing off in my brain. How beautiful. Nothing is sacred because there is no such thing as sacred. The ecological crisis, therefore, may be understood as a spiritual crisis, a crisis of meaning and mutual belonging. This brings us face to face with what psychologists are calling eco-anxiety, the real-time, present moment emotional challenge of environmental degradation. Yet there are countless other ways of looking, and within each we can find the unfathomable beauty and import of each human heart, of each being. A view that places us in meaningful relation to ourselves, to one another, and to the cosmos. This this view or that view can inspire a lifetime of sensitive, robust, unwavering service to the beloved. Come what may. Our traditions might respond in offering the inspiration and practices to meet and soothe eco-anxiety and respond in a way that truly leads onward to a just and sustainable world. So, that's what I wanted to open up for us, is to see what is on offer here as ways of looking and to ask ourselves what leads onward. What can we harvest from our spiritual traditions that we need so urgently now to hold and sustain our hearts into sustainability? Okay, so I'm going to ask an opening question here. We go through, actually, I think I'm going to hand it off. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hand it off to Aubrey. So, welcome, Aubrey. Yeah, you can share with us your perspective from the movement.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I want to start by saying thank you to Green Souls and Interfaith Power and Light for inviting me to speak here today, and a special thanks to Maddie and Emily for working so hard to get these great panelists prepared and excited to present. As Kristen mentioned, I'm an environmental lawyer and I work on global issues, most recently on negotiating the biggest treaties in the history of both international and environmental law. I work primarily in Muslim-majority countries and with their populations to further their treaty obligations, which remain the most powerful antidote to the climate crisis that we see today. I am the only Muslim woman that I know of influencing NGO, government, industry, faith, and civic partners at this level, and one of the few women in this arena. I'm putting that out there because I want to pick up on that thread later, hopefully. I speak to you today as an observer of the Me Too movement. Hopefully everyone is familiar with what that is. You see some heads nodding. And the increasingly disturbing signs of the earth heating out of control. I invite you to consider how these two things are linked and reflect on the implications of that as we talk. So for me, the most deeply satisfying and motivating factor in my work is the spiritual alignment that I feel with it. God says in the Holy Quran, which is the book that all Muslims of every walk of life and sect follow and believe to be the Word of God, in Surah Al-Falaq, that He created the world so that He would be known to us. Specifically, it says, "It is Allah who has created the heavens and the earth, the like of them. His commandments are sent between them so that you would know that God has power over all things, and that God's knowledge encompasses all." So this tells us that we may know God by knowing His creations, including women. There are many, many verses in the Quran that refer to the most beautiful aspects of the earth as miracles of God. The animals, the fruit-bearing trees, the stars in the sky, the mountains, and the life-giving water. The sacred life of God's creatures, including those as tiny as an ant. For those of you familiar with the Quran, there's a whole chapter in the Quran that's named for the Arabic word for ant. So the Quran forbids anyone in a time of war the Quran forbids anyone in a time of war to desecrate land or murder animals or burn fields, and it describes the pinnacle of heaven in terms of the natural world, giant fruit trees and flowing water in abundance. Just as there are verses extolling the earth, there are also many verses dedicated to the protection, elevation, and defense of women and their divine feminine birthright, which is linked to Mother Earth. So what does this tell us about how God directs believers to treat His own earth and His own creation? It tells us that God is inviting us to see and to witness the divine in everything, that every living thing is worthy of dignity and divine treatment, and yes, of protection. This ties in very well with what you were saying about seeing, so I'm going to pick up on that in a minute. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who all Muslims consider to be the last messenger of God,
took a stand for women in his final sermon before his death. He said that women have absolute rights, that men may only marry women under God's protection and permission, and he warned us to treat them with kindness. There are many scholars that have pointed to the significance of this being his final sermon before his death, as an ominous warning against the mistreatment of women that God knew would come. Today we see the objectification and destruction of Mother Earth, and the objectification and destruction of women as the root of all ills. To treat either well requires a maturation of one's relationship with the earth and a maturing of one's relationship with women. That which gives us life is the most revered thing to God, so much so that he extends his divine protection to them and commands us to do so as well. This is the ultimate advocacy, in my humble opinion, to be worthy of following God's command, to care for women and the earth, and to cherish both as the very source of life, as an extension of the divine, which is also the source of that creation. So I want to invite you to reflect on how these two things must be addressed together in any form of advocacy, including faith-based activism, and to join me in discussing how to do that today. So I find audiences, are most interested in solutions. So I want to mention this concept of Wetico and the antidote to that. I think it ties very well with Kristen's comments about investing in looking in ways of looking and ways of seeing that could lead to greater or less suffering. So Wetico is an Algonquin word for a cannibalistic spirit that is driven by greed, excess, and selfish consumption. It deludes the host into believing that cannibalizing the life force of others is a logical and morally upright way to live. It's a false separation of the self from nature. It describes both the infection and the person infected. It's characterized by several things. So the first thing it's characterized by is that the destruction is justified in the name of progress by the perpetrator and his inability to see and identify it in oneself. The initial act of consuming, it creates a residual desire to consume even more, and the host carrier ends up with an icy heart, a lack of empathy and compassion. It exists both within a person and within these superstructures, that we see today. It actually spreads by people trying to actively fight it in traditional ways. So the only way to undermine Wetico, according to these Native American historians and authors, is to invest in new ways of looking, is to actually see Wetico, so that you can figure out the cultural hacks to undermine how it actually works within you. So the clear analog to this in interpersonal relationships is patriarchy. Earth is our greatest resource, and we see how people have organized superstructures to squeeze everything in a transactional manner. Similarly, women, this is my hypothesis, women are men's greatest resource. And the relationships that are here today in the earth are still primarily organized so that women do the majority of tangible and intangible labor. And the only way to combat this is to organize our lives in new ways, down to the way that we treat each other, the way that we treat money, as Kristen mentioned. So I'm going to stop there and invite you to speak with me further about this. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. The spiritual framework that generates my commitment to living rightly on the earth is a view of this earth, this world, as a garden of life, a community of life, that the book of Genesis calls paradise, a garden of abundance, filled with diverse and multifarious forms of life, interdependent, the heavens and the earth, the waters, the trees, the plants, the fishes, the stars, and human beings. My spiritual framework is human beings are citizens of this garden of life, that our citizenship obliges us to live rightly in this world. My view also is that paradise is here and now, permeates the whole earth. And that the spiritual dilemma in this framework is that we are disoriented from where we actually are. We don't see this world as sacred. We don't hear the call, the king of Moses, take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. And we think of paradise as lost at the beginning of time, accessible at the end of time, or above this world instead of here, now, and ourselves in the midst of it. So that the spiritual transformation needed is a transformation of our capacity to fully experience where we are right now, which includes not only fully experiencing and seeing the community of life, the interdependence of all life, but also seeing the harm and the alienation that is happening. We have to be right here, right now, awake, alert, and engaging our powers of life in the service of life. That's the framework I work on. But as a Christian, I want to share that I first began to work on environmental issues because of the work of John Cobb, who in 1972 wrote a book called Is It Too Late? This was the first book by a Christian theologian raising ecological concern. And in 1972, Cobb raised the alarm that environmental damage was taking place at a tremendous rate, perhaps too fast to stop or reverse the devastation to many life systems on the planet. And so John became my teacher, and I did my doctoral work with him. For this reason, I know that there are Christian theologians for almost 50 years now who have been querying the religious frameworks of how we view the world, and have been looking deeply at how Christian theologies and frameworks bear significant responsibility for the damage that has happened. So though I just offered a Christian view of this world as paradise, it's a minority view, and part of what Christian theology asks us to do is to look at some of the majority views that have been operating for almost 1,000 years, causing tremendous harm. And I want to name just 3 of them that may be very familiar to you. And these are all about what Christian calls views. The views, or my teacher John Cobb calls frameworks of meaning. The frameworks out of which we operate culturally have tremendous power and have to be critiqued for whether they are serving life or harming life. So here's 3 Christian frameworks, highly problematic. Dominion theology, apocalyptic theology, and fall redemption theologies, where redemption comes through sacrifice or violence. So just quickly, dominion theology is the one that Lynn White raised in the 60s as a problematic Christian framework. The idea that God created humanity is to have dominion over the earth, to multiply and subdue, as Genesis 1:28 is sometimes translated. This text has been used to justify human exploitation of the earth in many ways, as if the gift of life itself were a warrant for abuse. So you can't separate dominion theology from male dominance over women, white dominance over people of color, dominance over children, over disabled bodies, over queer bodies, over the earth. So this is one highly problematic framework in Christian theology that has to be deconstructed. Apocalyptic theology is the idea that this earth is a dualistic battleground between good and evil, and that ultimately God will win this battle by utterly destroying this earth and replacing it with a new one. There are people who hold seats in Congress who believe this theology. The third framework needs critiquing is the notion that
The Garden of Eden, we lost the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve sinned, and it's lost at the beginning of time. It's only restored, given through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, and only attained after this life or in the future. Sacrificial redemptive theologies justify the sacrifice of lives, of animal lives, of men sacrificing women's lives, and white people sacrificing the lives of labor people of color. Redemptive sacrifice is an extremely harmful and dangerous theology that has fueled Western colonization under Christian influence. What we need is a restoration of the alternative strands of Christian tradition that are non-dualistic, interdependent, life-affirming, and centered in the power that all of us have and the responsibility all of us have within the community of life to be stewards of life.
Hi, I'm Robert